She was 14, homeless, and hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. But the moment she saw that scroll behind the glass, something ancient and electric moved through her like a current. The most powerful scholars in the room had already failed. The corporations had already made their deals, and nobody, not one person in that gilded museum, thought to worry about the quiet girl in the worn-out hoodie standing at the edge of the crowd. That was their first mistake, and it would not be their last. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The Hargrove Museum of Cultural Heritage had never looked so full of itself, but banners stretched across the stone facade announcing the evening's event in gold lettering. Discovery Unveiled, the Aldrin Scroll. Camera crews jostled for position at the base of the wide marble steps. Private cars idled in a line that curved around the block, each one carrying someone who believed tonight would confirm something they already assumed to be true. Inside, the marble floors caught every footstep and threw the sound back twice as loud. The vaulted ceilings were draped in soft amber lighting, and the air smelled faintly of old paper and expensive cologne. Champagne flutes clinked. Laughter echoed. The city's most respected names in archaeology, linguistics, law, and corporate finance had gathered to witness what was being called the most significant document discovery of the decade. At the center of it all, out behind a curved wall of climate-controlled glass, lay the scroll. It rested on a gently angled display platform, its surface a pale tan color that had deepened in places to the shade of dark honey. It was roughly the length of a man's arm and about as wide as two open hands placed side by side. The edges had frayed slightly with time, and sections of it were stained with the faint ghost shapes of whatever soil and moisture had surrounded it for centuries. But the text itself was remarkably preserved, every symbol clear, every line deliberate. Whatever hand had set those marks down had not been careless. Most of the guests ignored it entirely. They circulated the room with drinks and conversation, pausing at the glass only long enough to nod appreciatively and move on. The scroll was a means to an end. They were not there to understand it. They were there for what owning it would mean. Standing near the podium and surrounded by museum staff and legal representatives was Victor Hale, the corporate developer whose foundation had co-funded the dig that recovered the scroll. He was tall, silver-haired, dressed in a navy suit that had been cut very precisely. He spoke in the measured tone of a man who was accustomed to rooms listening when he entered them. His company, Hale Development Group, had quietly tied the scroll's discovery to a land dispute involving a tract of mineral-rich terrain on the outer edge of the city. If the scroll could be properly translated and shown to confirm historical ownership claims his lawyers were already building, it would unlock a development deal worth well over $3 billion. He had been patient. He had been careful. Tonight, he expected confirmation. The museum's lead curator, Dr. Leonard Ashby, took the podium to polite applause. He was a compact, gray-bearded man with the careful speech of someone who chose every word with the awareness that someone was always recording. He explained the discovery in broad terms. The scroll had been unearthed during an excavation in the eastern perimeter of the disputed land, apparently sealed inside a stone cavity that had gone undisturbed for an indeterminate but significant period of time. Preliminary carbon analysis placed it at an age that was, he said, profoundly ancient. The language in which it was written had not yet been identified. That admission quieted the room for a moment. Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Doctor?" Ashby gestured to the three linguists seated on a raised platform to the right of the podium. They were introduced with great ceremony, Professor William Greer from the university's Classical Languages Department, Dr. Sandra Hollins, who had spent 15 years studying proto-written systems of the ancient world, and a visiting scholar from overseas, whose credentials filled half a paragraph in the printed program. They were, Dr. Ashby assured the room, the best available minds for this task. Professor Greer went first. He approached the case with a handheld magnifier and a small lamp and studied the scroll in silence for 2 full minutes. Then he straightened, returned to the platform, and began speaking in the careful tone of someone who had already decided that confidence was more important than accuracy. Now, he noted similarities to known pre-alphabetic systems, suggested a possible derivative link to certain early Mesopotamian forms, and proposed that with time, weeks, perhaps a few months, a working framework could be assembled. No translation, no reading. A framework. The murmur in the room was not enthusiastic. Dr. Hollins approached next. She was more honest, which made her less useful to the people who had organized the evening. She stood at the glass for a long time, moved from one end of the scroll to the other twice, and then turned back to the room with an expression that was more fascinated than frustrated. She said the language showed structural patterns unlike anything in the known catalog of proto-written systems. The symbols appeared to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. She had never seen anything like it. She needed time to study it properly. A real translation would require deep research, cross-referencing, and potentially new analytical tools. This was not what anyone had paid to hear. The visiting scholar offered little beyond a murmured agreement with Dr. Hollins and an apology for the limitations of existing scholarship. The applause when the 3 of them returned to their seats was polite in the way that disappointment tries to be gracious. Victor Hale was already on his phone. Outside the museum, on the far side of the rear service road, a girl crouched behind a row of black plastic utility bins and ate the last third of a granola bar she had found tucked beneath a trash bag that someone had not quite closed all the way. She ate it slowly and without self-pity, the way a person eats when they have learned not to rush what might be the last meal for a while. Her name was Nyla Carter. She was 14 years old. She was small for her age and wore a faded gray hoodie 2 sizes too large, canvas sneakers that had cracked at the toes, and dark jeans that had been hemmed at the bottom by someone who used whatever thread was available. She had a small backpack that contained most of what she owned: a change of clothes, a worn spiral notebook, a pencil case with 4 pencils, and a stub of eraser, and a library card she still carried even though she had not had a fixed address for almost a year. Neela was not a sad girl, or at least she did not think of herself as one. She was a careful girl, a watching girl. She had learned that the world rewarded attention, the kind of attention most people did not bother with. She noticed exits before she noticed entrances. She noticed which security guards made their rounds at what intervals. She noticed how many cars were parked with their lights on, which meant drivers waiting, which meant activity, which sometimes meant leftover food if you were patient and stayed small. She had been outside the museum for most of the evening. The event had drawn a crowd dense enough to create cover, and cover was useful. A guard had noticed her near the side service entry about 40 minutes ago and moved her along with the particular dismissal that security officers reserved for people without invitations. She had circled the block and come back from the other side. When a catering van pulled up to the loading dock with a delivery that required 2 men and 3 trips, Nyla watched, waited, and slipped through the propped-open service door on the second trip while both men had their hands full. Inside, she moved quietly through a narrow corridor that smelled of floor wax and old stone. She was not trying to steal anything. She was cold, and she was curious, and she had learned that museums, unlike most buildings, were full of corners that people had stopped noticing. She turned a corner and stepped into the edge of the main hall. The light was warm and the room was loud with conversation. People in dark, formal clothes moved in clusters between display cases and tall standing panels. Nobody looked at her. She was dressed wrong for the room and too young, and both of those things had a way of making people look through rather than at. She drifted along the far wall, eyes moving from face to face, reading the dynamics of the room with the instinct of someone who had spent years in spaces where she needed to know who might become a problem. And then she saw the scroll. She stopped walking. She was still 30 feet away, on the wrong side of the room, with a cluster of guests between her and the display case. But she could see it clearly through the glass. The amber light fell across it at an angle that made the symbols catch just so, and something in her chest went absolutely still. It was not confusion. It was not curiosity in the ordinary sense. It was the sharp electric sensation of recognition, the kind that lives deeper than the conscious mind. I'm the kind that arrives before you have words for it. She had seen those shapes before, not in a book, not on a screen. Somewhere much older. Somewhere in the interior of her own memory. She started moving toward it without deciding to. A woman in a red dress noticed her first and leaned to whisper something to the man beside her. A museum staffer near the display case straightened and took a step in her direction. Neela did not look at any of them. She looked at the scroll. She reached the glass and pressed her fingertips against it lightly. The symbols closest to her, a sequence of 7 marks running in a diagonal line across the upper left section, tugged at something deep in her memory. She heard sounds, not quite sounds, the memory of sounds. A calm voice counting through patterns. A room lit by firelight. "Be miss!" The staffer's hand came down on her shoulder. "You can't be here." "That's not a contract," Neela said quietly. "Not exactly." The staffer paused. "Excuse me?" She turned. 3 or 4 people nearby had stopped their conversations. One of them, a younger man in a gray blazer with a lanyard around his neck, was looking at her with an expression that was not dismissal. It was something more careful than that. "What did you just say?" Professor Greer had turned from a conversation halfway across the room. "I said it's not exactly a contract." Nyla's voice was steady, not defiant. Quiet, the way a person speaks when they are more interested in being accurate than in being believed. It's something else combined with a contract. The structure is different. There was a beat of silence that lasted about 2 seconds before the laughter began. It was not cruel laughter, not entirely. It was the automatic laughter of a room that has just been given something incongruous. A girl who was visibly homeless, visibly out of place, visibly too young, making a claim about something that had just defeated 3 specialists with combined decades of experience. The laughter was a release valve. It was easier than the alternative. Professor Greer shook his head with the patiently amused expression of a man who enjoyed correcting people. "Young lady, this text has no identified phonetic framework. You cannot read it in any meaningful sense, because the sounds it represents, if it represents sounds at all, are completely unknown." The younger man with the lanyard, Dr. Ethan Cole, a research linguist attached to the museum's Visiting Scholars program, had moved closer. He was watching Neela's face, not the way people usually watched her face, which was the way someone watches a problem. He was watching the way you watch someone solve an equation you don't yet understand. Nyla looked at the scroll. Then she leaned slightly forward and spoke. What came out of her mouth was not English. It was not anything in the room's frame of reference. It was a sequence of sounds that moved at a specific cadence, some clicks and some tonal slides, and some sounds that sat in the back of the throat in a way that made the air between her and the glass seem briefly different. She spoke a single sentence, maybe 12 seconds long. Then she stopped. The room had gone completely silent. Even the people who had not been paying attention had stopped. The air had changed in some indefinable way. The sound she had produced was not dramatic. It was not loud, not theatrical. It had the quality of something that fit, the way a key fits a lock, unspectacular and absolute. It says approximately, she paused, gathering the translation carefully, "This land does not belong to those who claim it. It belongs to those who protect its truth." The silence extended for several more seconds. Then Professor Greer said, "That's impossible." His voice had lost some of its ease. "That language has no known phonetics. You cannot have a pronunciation for something that has never been decoded." Nayla looked at him calmly. "You're reading it wrong. It's not written to be seen." She turned back to the scroll. "It's written to be heard." The applause that followed was sparse and uncertain. A few people clapped because they did not know what else to do. Most simply stood where they were, drinks suspended in midair, expressions caught somewhere between fascination and discomfort. Victor Hale's phone was back in his pocket. He was watching Nyla with his full attention now, and the calculation behind his eyes was not admiration. Dr. Ashby conferred with the security supervisor in a rapid, low exchange, and the decision was made quickly. The girl would not be ejected. Not yet. Not while there was any chance she knew something useful. Within 4 minutes of her reading, Nyla found herself being guided, not unkindly but not gently either, through a side door and down a corridor toward a back-of-house conference room used by visiting scholars. It was a small room with a round table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard, and a bad overhead light. Someone brought her a glass of water. Nobody brought food, though she noticed the tray of leftover catering sandwiches on a side table, and did not take any, because taking them felt like agreeing to something she had not yet agreed to. Dr. Ashby sat across from her. Professor Greer stood near the door with his arms crossed, still wearing the expression of a man whose authority had been inconvenienced. Dr. Hollins pulled a chair up and sat close, leaning forward with the notebooks and tools of someone who had suddenly become very interested very fast. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of the room. He had not been officially included in this gathering, but he had followed, and no one had told him to leave. "I need you to understand, Doctor," Ashby began carefully, "that what you did out there, whatever that was, has put a lot of people in a complicated position. This is a controlled scholarly environment. The authentication process for a document like this one takes months." Nyla said nothing. She was looking at the glossy print of scroll photographs spread on the table, which someone had set out before she arrived. They had been planning to work through them tonight. "We need to know how you did that," Dr. Hollins said. She was not unkind. She was simply ablaze with professional urgency. "Show me more of it," Nyla said. "The photographs." Dr. Hollins slid 3 additional high-resolution prints toward her. Nyla turned the first one and studied it for about 20 seconds. Then she began speaking, quietly and steadily, moving through a section of the scroll's upper register. She paused twice to reconstruct the tonal sequence, closed her eyes briefly on the second pause, and then finished the passage and looked up. "That section is describing a system," she said. "The language isn't linear, it layers. Each symbol can mean different things depending on what order you read the surrounding symbols and at what pitch you say it aloud. There's a base meaning and then deeper meanings sitting underneath that are only accessible if you know the tonal rules." Dr. Hollins had her pen moving before Nayla finished the second sentence. Professor Greer was no longer standing near the door with his arms crossed. He had moved unconsciously to the table. "That's a form of tonal coding," Dr. Hollins said, more to herself than to the room. "We've theorized systems like that, but never found a surviving example with enough intact text to demonstrate it." "It's more than that," Nayla said. "It's also a warning system. Some sections are legal code, and some sections are—" She paused, looking for the right word. "Like instructions. For people who would come after, about what they're responsible for." At the edge of the room, Ethan had opened his own notebook and was writing fast. Behind the closed conference room door, down the corridor, Victor Hale was speaking in a low voice to a man named Gary, whom he kept for situations that required a certain kind of efficiency. He told Gary he wanted everything there was to find on the girl: name, background, school enrollment records, any adult connections, any case history. He wanted it by morning. Gary nodded once and left. Back in the conference room, Nyla had reached the end of the third photograph and looked up. "Who taught you this?" Professor Greer asked. His voice had changed. The instructive condescension was gone. In its place was something closer to naked need. Nyla looked at him. "I'm not answering that." "You understand that this is an enormously significant—" "I understand what it is," she said quietly. "I'm not answering that question." Dr. Ashby tried a softer angle. He explained that verifying the authenticity of her translation was important, and that her background and training would help establish credibility for the academic record. Nyla understood what he was actually saying. He was saying that a girl with no institution behind her, no credentials, no name that meant anything in a room like this one, and needed external legitimacy in order for her knowledge to count. She had heard versions of that her whole life. Knowledge belonged to people with proof of where they got it. She had no proof, just the knowledge itself. "I can tell you what it says," she said. "That's what I can give you." Dr. Hollins, to her credit, said, "That's enough for now." Professor Greer looked as if he disagreed, but said nothing. Ethan crossed the room and sat in the empty chair beside Nyla. He did it naturally, the way you sit next to someone you are on the same side as. "I'd like to keep going, if you're willing," he said to her directly. "Not for the record right now. Just to understand." She studied him for a moment. He had the face of someone who had not yet decided what to do about something that surprised him, and she found that more trustworthy than confidence. "Next section," she said. Ethan slid another photograph across the table. She worked through it carefully. This passage sat near the lower quarter of the scroll, and the symbols here were slightly different in weight, denser, pressed deeper into the material, as if the hand that made them had been more deliberate. When she had assembled the tonal sequence and run it twice through silently, she spoke it aloud. Then she sat very still for a moment before translating. It says, "Those who misuse the land will awaken what was buried beneath it." The room was quiet in a different way than before, not stunned, uneasy. Dr. Hollins set her pen down. "Awaken what, specifically?" "It doesn't say, not in this section." Nyla looked at the photograph carefully. "But the way the symbols are structured around that line, it's not a metaphor, it's an instruction, like a legal consequence clause." "A consequence clause in an ancient document," Professor Greer said slowly. "Yes." He sat down. The conference room had grown quieter and somehow smaller. Outside in the main hall, the event was winding down. Glasses being collected, guests beginning to disperse. But in this back room, the evening felt like it was just starting. And then something happened that Nyla had not anticipated. Dr. Hollins read aloud in her academic voice a particular sequence of symbols from the lower left corner of the second photograph, a sequence she had noted as structurally unusual. She read it in the flat, voiceless way of a linguist working with text she does not yet know how to sound. Nyla's breath caught. She was suddenly somewhere else, not completely. Part of her was still in the room, still aware of the table and the chairs and the bad overhead light. But another part of her was standing in a much smaller space, a room with bare walls and a low ceiling, and a fire going in a metal barrel in the corner. A man sitting across from her, patient and careful, his voice shaping sounds that she was supposed to repeat. Not letters, not words in any language she knew. Sounds. Just sounds, and the shapes her mouth had to make to produce them, and the pitch that had to carry through them, and the sequence that had to be right, or the whole thing was wrong. She had been very young, 6, maybe 7. She had not understood what she was learning or why. She had only understood that it mattered. because everything about the man who was teaching her communicated that it mattered enormously, with a steadiness that never became urgency and never became fear. Nyla. She came back. Ethan was looking at her. "You went somewhere," he said quietly, not accusing, observing. "I'm fine," she said. She straightened in the chair. He did not push it. Later that night, after the scholars had taken their photographs and notes back to the main archive room to continue working, and Dr. Ashby had made arrangements for Nyla to stay in a small staff restroom rather than going back out into the cold, an arrangement she had accepted with the flat practicality of someone who knew when shelter was shelter. 2 other conversations were happening. In a glass-walled office on the museum's 2nd floor, Dr. Ashby was on a video call with someone whose face Nyla would not have recognized, but whose name appeared on the donor wall in the lobby. The conversation was short. The word used twice was liability. And in the hallway outside the archive room, Victor Hale stood with Gary, who had already made 3 calls and located a name. The name meant nothing on its own, no school records, no guardian registration, no address history. A shelter intake form from 11 months ago with a name and an approximate age and nothing else. "If she's lying," Victor said, looking at the closed archive door, "we expose her. If she's telling the truth," he paused, "then we own her." Inside the archive room, behind that closed door, Ethan Cole was sitting alone with the scroll photographs spread across a long table and his notebook open in front of him. He had spent the better part of an hour trying to work backward from Nyla's translations, to find the logic that connected symbol to sound to meaning. He had fragments. Not enough, but enough to know that what she was doing was real. The internal consistency was there. The structural rules she had described checked out against every line she had translated. Whatever she knew it completely. He sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he wrote a single line in his notebook, underlined it, and did not know yet how important it would turn out to be. She's not translating. She's remembering. The rest of that night passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Nyla slept a few hours on a narrow cot in the staff restroom, woke before 5 in the morning out of old habit, and lay still listening to the building settle around her. The museums at night had a particular kind of silence, not empty, but held, like the building itself was paying attention to what it contained. By the time anyone official arrived to find her, she was already awake and sitting on the edge of the cot with her notebook open across her knees, working through symbol sequences from memory. She had written down everything she could recall from the photographs the night before. Not to share, to keep, because keeping things in writing was the only insurance she had ever been able to afford. The morning brought a different energy to the museum. The public-facing event was over. The guests with their champagne and their assumptions were gone. What remained was the actual work, or what passed for it. And the atmosphere in the archive corridor had shifted from performance into something more tightly wound. 2 additional staff members had arrived early. A lock had been added to the archive room door overnight. Nyla noticed both things without commenting on either. Ethan found her just after 6 and brought coffee and a wrapped breakfast sandwich from a cart down the block. He set them on the cot beside her without making it a gesture. She ate without ceremony, and he sat in the room's single chair and did not speak until she had finished. "They want to continue the session," he said. "Officially this time, with documentation." "Who decides what happens to the documentation?" He was quiet for a moment. "The museum, and the foundation attached to it." Victor Hale's foundation. Yes. She closed her notebook. "Then I need to know what I'm translating before I say it out loud in a room where someone is writing it down." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's fair." They reached a quiet agreement before the formal session began. Nyla would continue working through the scroll photographs, but she would share her translations with Ethan first, privately, before anything was committed to the official record. It was a small protection, and both of them knew it. But small protections were the kind Nyla had learned to take seriously. The session that morning was held in the larger archive room with better lighting and a proper table long enough to spread multiple photographs side by side. Dr. Hollins was present and engaged. Professor Greer arrived late and said little but watched everything. A junior staff member sat in the corner with a laptop and the blinking cursor of a transcription document open on the screen. Nyla worked from the middle section of the scroll outward. She had already covered parts of the upper and lower registers the night before, and now she moved into the dense central band where the symbols were most tightly packed and the tonal layering was most complex. This section was where the scroll's true architecture revealed itself, and she went carefully, aware that she was reading something that had been designed to resist being read casually. She explained what she was doing as she went, partly for Ethan and partly because articulating it helped her hold the sequences together. "The language has 3 registers," she said, tracing a line of symbols without touching the photograph. "Surface, structural, and embedded. The surface meaning is what you'd get if you tried to decode it like a standard script. Basic vocabulary, rough grammar. But the structural meaning only opens if you read the symbols in the right spatial order, not left to right, not top to bottom, but in a pattern that the surrounding symbols indicate. And the embedded meaning is tonal. It lives in how the sounds interact with each other in sequence. Change the pitch on a single sound, and you get a completely different clause." Dr. Hollins had stopped writing and was simply staring. "You're describing a language that's simultaneously a written and a spoken system, where neither half is complete without the other." "Yes," Nyla said. "That shouldn't exist. No known ancient civilization developed anything with that level of—" "They didn't need to develop it," Nyla said quietly. "They inherited it." The room held that thought without knowing what to do with it. She translated 3 more passages that morning. The first described the physical boundaries of the land in question, using geographical markers that Ethan quietly noted appeared to correspond to actual terrain features on old survey maps. The second described a set of custodial obligations, specific environmental protections, community access rights, and record-keeping duties that any party claiming the land was required to honor in perpetuity. The third passage was the one that changed the temperature of the room. She assembled the tonal sequence carefully, ran it once under her breath, and then looked up. "This section is a warning," she said. "Different from the consequence clause last night. That one described what happens when the land is misused. This one describes what happens when the document itself is misused." She spoke it aloud. The sounds moved through the room the same way they had in the main hall the night before. Not loud, but with a quality of fit that made the air around them feel briefly different. Then she translated, "If opened without understanding, the ground itself will betray the unworthy." Nobody laughed this time. Professor Greer had gone still in a way that was not entirely professional. The transcription assistant's fingers had stopped moving. Dr. Hollins was writing again, but her handwriting, usually neat and small, had grown larger on the page. "Betray how?" Ethan asked. "Why, the language doesn't give a mechanism," Nyla said. "It gives a certainty. The phrasing is absolute in the original, not conditional, not a warning in the sense of maybe, in the sense of this will happen." Victor Hale was not in the archive room that morning. He had left the museum around midnight and returned at 9 with 2 lawyers and a man in a technical services jacket who spent 45 minutes in the security office. When he emerged, the museum's head of security walked him through the corridor outside the archive room and spoke in a low voice about access logs and camera positions. Victor asked several quiet questions. He received several quiet answers. Inside the archive room, nobody knew any of that yet. The session broke for lunch. Neela stayed at the table while everyone else filtered out, studying the photographs in the unhurried way she had when she needed to understand something deeply rather than quickly. She was alone for about 4 minutes before Ethan came back in and closed the door behind him. "I need to tell you something," he said. He sat down across from her. "One of the junior researchers told me this morning that the security footage from last night, the corridor outside the scroll display where you first approached it, was wiped, overwritten, between midnight and 2 in the morning." Nyla looked at him without surprise. "Someone in the building. Has to be. The scroll itself? Still here, still locked in the case." She thought about that. Someone had tried and either failed or decided not to take it, which meant the footage wasn't wiped to cover a theft. It was wiped to cover a presence. Someone who had been in the building after the event ended and who did not want a record of it. "Ethan," she said, "what exactly is in that last section? The part nobody has been able to reach yet. The final quarter of the scroll." "We haven't translated it." "I know," she said, "but you have the photographs. Has anyone tried to describe the symbols? Structurally, without translation?" He pulled a folder from the table and opened it. The final quarter of the scroll was photographed in 3 overlapping images, and the symbols here were unlike anything in the earlier sections. They were larger, set wider apart, and arranged in a circular pattern rather than the linear bands that structured the rest of the document. Neela looked at them for a long time. Then she reached into her backpack and took out her spiral notebook. She opened it to a page near the back where she had written something earlier that morning before Ethan arrived, while the building was still quiet. She turned it so he could see. The marks on the page matched the symbols in the photograph almost exactly. Ethan stared. "You wrote that this morning?" "I've seen it before," she said. "Not the scroll. Something else, a long time ago." She closed the notebook again. "He told me never to read that section aloud unless I knew who was listening." The words hung in the room. Ethan understood enough by now to ask the right question. "Who told you?" Nyla was quiet for a moment. Outside in the corridor, footsteps moved past the door. She waited until they faded. "Someone taught me this language when I was little," she said. "I didn't know what it was. I didn't know why. He taught me like I might need it someday, and he didn't have much time. And then, one winter, he was gone." She said it flatly, the way you describe weather. "I don't know what happened to him, but he knew this document existed. He said, 'One day they'll find it, and they'll lie about what it says.'" Ethan set down his pen. "They're not trying to read it," Nyla said. Her voice was quiet, but no longer flat. Something harder had come into it. "They're trying to find out what it says so they can decide what version of it to release. Victor Hale doesn't want a translation. He wants a version he can use." She looked at the photographs spread across the table. "They're not trying to understand it. They're trying to own the interpretation of it." Ethan did not argue, because she was right, and he had known it since the night before. And he had been waiting to see if she would arrive at it on her own. "We need to get to the full scroll," she said. "Not the photographs, the actual document. There are elements in the original that the photographs don't capture. Variations in depth, in texture. The tonal map embedded in the physical surface. I can't complete the reading from images alone. Access to the original is restricted. Victor's lawyers filed additional security parameters this morning." "I know," she said. "That's why we need to go tonight." They did not go that night. They went the night after. The delay was Ethan's idea. One night gave him time to confirm 2 things: which staff member owed him a quiet favor, and which camera in the archive corridor had the longest gap in its rotation cycle. He was not naturally a person who thought in terms of blind spots and favors, but Nyla had a way of making practical thinking feel urgent, and urgency had a way of clarifying what mattered. In the meantime, Victor moved. At 10 in the morning, 48 hours after Nyla had first spoken at the display case, a press conference was held in the museum's public briefing room. Victor stood at the podium flanked by Dr. Ashby and a lawyer whose suit was more expensive than the curator's salary. He spoke with the measured confidence of a man who had prepared every sentence in advance and tested each one for weakness. He announced that the translation of the Aldrin Scroll was actively underway under the supervision of the museum's academic partners, that the process was proceeding with appropriate scholarly rigor, and that the results would confirm what historical and geographic evidence already strongly suggested, that the land in question had no prior covenant claim that could supersede existing legal title. He did not mention Nyla by name. He referred once to unverified claims made by an unauthorized individual, and said the museum was committed to ensuring the authentication process remained untainted by outside interference. He said development of the site would proceed on schedule. Nyla watched a recording of the press conference on Ethan's laptop that evening in the archive room. She watched it twice. The second time, she was not watching Victor. She was watching Dr. Ashby, who stood behind the podium the entire time with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was now waiting to find out whether it was the right one. He hasn't translated anything," she said when the video ended. "He's announcing a conclusion before the evidence exists." "That's how you control a narrative," Ethan said. "You establish the expectation first, then any translation that contradicts it looks like the anomaly." She understood that. She had seen smaller versions of it her whole life, the way institutions decided what was true about a person before they ever looked at the person directly. That night, just after 1 in the morning, Ethan used a staff keycard borrowed from a colleague who had gone home sick and not yet missed it, and he and Nyla slipped into the archive room through the side access corridor. The building was not empty. Museums never truly emptied. But the night security rotation had a reliable gap between 1 and 1:30, and they moved through it cleanly. The scroll was in its case. The climate controls hummed, the room smelled of preservation chemicals and old stone. Nyla stood in front of the case and looked at the scroll under the soft conservation lighting for a long moment before she spoke. "I need to work through it in full sequence," she said quietly. "From the beginning. Don't write anything down yet. Just listen." Ethan stood back and listened. She began at the opening register and moved through the scroll systematically, speaking each section aloud in the original language and then rendering it in English. She moved faster than she had in the formal sessions, not rushing, but without the performance of explaining her method. This was what she knew. She moved through it the way you move through a space you have memorized. But the opening sections confirmed what she had already translated: the boundary definitions, the custodial obligations, the consequence clause, and the warning passage. But as she moved into the sections she had not yet fully covered, the document's true scope began to open. The scroll was not, Ethan realized as she worked, a land deed in any conventional sense. It was something layered and strange and far more serious than a property claim. It established a covenant, an active living agreement between the land and those who occupied it, with specific enforceable terms on both sides. The land provided, the occupants protected, and the terms of that protection were detailed, practical, and not negotiable. Environmental preservation clauses, burial ground protections, community access requirements, witness record obligations, and threaded through all of it a structural concept that had no clean English equivalent, something that Nyla rendered after a long pause as living accountability. The idea that the covenant did not expire with any particular generation. It transferred. It found whoever was capable of carrying it and passed through them to the next. "The protectors," Ethan said softly. "It's not a family line," Nyla said, confirming what she had already sensed. "It's not inherited by blood. It's assigned to whoever can hold the language and the memory and the responsibility together." She paused at a section near the lower center of the scroll. Her voice shifted slightly, not uncertain, but careful in a new way. "Ethan." "What?" She was very still. "There's a name here, a symbol name." One of the appointed speakers. She traced the pattern in the air above the glass without touching it. "I've seen this before, not in the scroll." "Where?" She did not answer immediately. She moved to the next section and continued translating, but Ethan noticed that her breathing had changed. She was working through something that was hitting her differently than the rest. The final legible section before the circular pattern of the last quarter contained what Nyla translated slowly, phrase by phrase, as the enforcement clause. If any party attempted to claim the land while knowingly concealing, falsifying, or suppressing the covenant's terms, all existing claims held by that party were immediately void. Not suspended. Void. And the custodial authority transferred automatically to whoever had last demonstrated living knowledge of the document in the presence of witnesses. She stopped translating. The silence in the room was very complete. "That's the whole thing," Ethan said quietly. He was not asking. He was trying to absorb what it meant. If Victor uses this document to push through a development claim while hiding what it actually says, he doesn't just lose the moral argument, he loses the legal one. The covenant voids his claim by its own terms. "Yes," Nyla said, "and the authority transfers to the living speaker," she said, "in the presence of witnesses." They stood in the quiet of the archive room for a moment with that sitting between them. Then Nyla straightened and looked at the lower section of the scroll one more time. With the symbol name she had noticed, the one she recognized from somewhere outside the scroll, was still there. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. The pattern was a sequence of 4 marks arranged in a loose diamond shape with a 5th mark at the center. She had seen it before. She was almost certain she had seen it in her own notebook, in old handwriting that was not hers. She did not say that yet. What she said was, "We need to go." They were back in the corridor and moving toward the side exit when the sound reached them. A door further along the building, opening with the particular sound of something being pushed rather than pulled. Then, footsteps. More than one set. Moving with the fast, quiet efficiency of people who knew where they were going and did not want to be heard. Ethan took Nyla's arm and they moved faster. They were through the side door and into the outer corridor when they heard, behind them, the sound of the archive room being unlocked. They did not run. Running created noise, and noise created attention, and Nyla had spent years knowing that the best way to move through a building unnoticed was to look like you already belonged in the next space you were moving toward. She walked with her head straight and her pace even, and Ethan matched her. And they were out the service exit and into the cold street air before anyone behind them had reason to raise an alarm. 2 blocks away, Ethan stopped walking and leaned against a wall and breathed. "Someone was going in there tonight regardless of us," he said. "Yes," Nyla said, "and now they know we were there too. The case will show condensation from being stood near. She'll see my breath on the glass." She looked back in the direction of the museum. The building's upper windows were lit. "They're going to move on us tomorrow, maybe tonight. Victor, he's going to try to detain me. Use the authorities, use my situation. No guardian, no records. Turn me into a legal problem so nobody has to listen to what I know." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then we can't be here when morning comes." She nodded once. They started walking. A block further on, Nyla stopped and turned back to look at the museum one more time. The gold lettering of the banner was still visible from here, caught in the light from a street lamp. Discovery unveiled. She stood there for a moment with a cold moving around her. "They think this is about land," she said, and not loudly, barely more than a thought spoken outward. "They don't even know what they're about to wake up." Then she turned and walked, and Ethan followed, and the city closed around them both the way cities do. Indifferent, enormous, and full of places to disappear into if you knew how to move. The row house sat on a narrow street that the city had mostly forgotten. It was 3 stories of dark brick, with boards across the ground floor windows, and a front door that had not been painted in so long the wood beneath had gone gray and soft at the edges. Ethan's grandfather had owned it for 40 years and lived in it for 20 of those, and when he died, he left it to nobody in particular, which in legal terms meant it stayed in a trust that nobody had bothered to dissolve. Ethan had a key. He had always had a key. He had just never had a reason to use it at 2 in the morning with a 14-year-old girl who knew a dead language and a corporation trying to find them both. Inside, the air was thick with the particular stillness of a place that had been closed too long. Dust on every surface. Old books stacked against walls in arrangements that had once made sense to someone. A kitchen with a working tap, and nothing in the cupboards but a tin of tea and a jar of instant coffee that had fused into a single solid mass. The heat worked, barely. Nyla stood in the center of the front room while Ethan went through the house checking windows and found herself staring at a shelf of field journals along the far wall, their spines labeled in small, careful handwriting by year and location. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was simply doing what she always did in unfamiliar spaces, reading the room before the room could read her. She pulled one journal from the shelf, then stopped. On the trunk beneath the shelf, half buried under a folded canvas map, was another journal, thicker than the rest and with a different binding. She lifted the canvas. The cover was worn smooth at the corners from handling. She opened it. The first page was a sketch. 7 symbols arranged in a diagonal line. She had seen those 7 symbols 2 nights ago in the upper left section of the Aldrin scroll, the first thing she had recognized when she pressed her fingers to the glass. She sat down on the floor right where she was and began reading. Ethan's grandfather, a field researcher named Douglas Cole, she had participated in an excavation of the disputed land site 31 years earlier. The journal covered 6 weeks of field work and then stopped abruptly in the middle of a sentence. The entries before that stopping point described, in the clip notation of a man more comfortable with maps than prose, the discovery of a stone cavity in the eastern perimeter, the recovery of what appeared to be an intact scroll in a sealed clay casing, and the subsequent arrival of a private contractor who presented legal paperwork and took control of the site within 72 hours of the discovery. Douglas Cole had copied every symbol he could before they locked him out. On a page near the back, in handwriting that had become less neat, he had written, "The text appears to identify a future speaker, not a past owner." Nyla read that line twice. Then she set the journal on her knee and looked at the wall for a moment while the shape of something very large rearranged itself in her mind. The scroll was not preserving a claim. It was not a historical record in the ordinary sense. It was oriented forward. It had been written with the expectation that whoever needed to read it had not yet arrived. Ethan came back into the room and found her on the floor with the journal. She showed him the page. He sat down beside her and read it, and was quiet for a long time. "He was there," Ethan said finally. "He found the original scroll, and they pushed him out before he could document it properly." "He documented what he could," Nyla said, "and he wrote down what it meant." She closed the journal carefully. The scroll wasn't waiting for someone to decode it. It was waiting for someone who already knew it. She told him the rest then. Not everything. There were parts she was still holding close because she did not yet know what to do with them, but the shape of it. The man who had raised her for a few years when she was very small. Not her father by blood. No real name that she had ever been given. He moved often and lived carefully and taught her the sounds and symbols the way you teach someone to swim. Not explaining the theory first, just putting them in the water and staying close until the motion became natural. He had 3 rules he repeated so consistently they had become the texture of her early childhood, rather than instructions she consciously remembered receiving. Never read the last section aloud unless you know who is listening. They will come for the speaker before they come for the truth. If they ever find the contract, run. She had run eventually, not because she found the contract, because he disappeared. One winter night she woke up, and he was not there, and he did not come back, and the small, careful life they had built in that bare-walled room by the fire barrel came apart quietly over the weeks that followed until she was on her own entirely. Ethan listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "He knew this was coming. He was preparing you for a specific moment." "Yes," she said, "I just didn't know what the moment looked like until 2 nights ago." While they worked through the journal, Victor Hale was doing what men like Victor did when control slipped. He built a story to replace the one he was losing. By morning, a carefully managed set of leaks had reached 3 separate news outlets. The details varied slightly by outlet, which was intentional. It created the impression of multiple independent sources. The core narrative was consistent. A troubled teenage runaway with no verifiable background had disrupted a legitimate academic event after apparently being coached by discredited academic figures with an agenda against the museum's primary donor. The museum had suffered a security breach. Artifacts were potentially at risk. The situation was being handled. Neela's name was not used. Her age was not given, but the description was specific enough that anyone who had been at the event would know exactly who was meant. Victor understood that he did not need to win the argument entirely. He only needed to make it complicated enough that nobody with institutional standing would want to attach themselves to her side of it. What Victor did not know, because Gary had not yet found it, was that the excavation Ethan's grandfather had participated in 31 years ago had been shut down, not for logistical reasons, as the official record stated, but because a junior site researcher had filed an internal complaint about the removal of artifacts without proper cataloging. That complaint had been buried. The researcher who filed it had later died in circumstances that the local coroner recorded as unremarkable. And the artifacts removed from the site, plural, not singular, had been logged under a private holding classification connected to an early version of what was now Hale Development Group's foundation. There were 2 scroll fragments. There had always been 2. Ethan found this in a scanned archive record on an academic database at 4 in the morning, cross-referencing his grandfather's journal notes against excavation filings from the same period. He sat with it for a while before he woke Nyla, because once he told her, the shape of everything would change again. She took it with the stillness she brought to all difficult information, not suppressing a reaction, but absorbing it before deciding what it meant. "He had the second piece the whole time," she said. "That's why he was so confident about the translation outcome. He already knew what the complete document said. He just needed to control what version the world heard." "The museum translation was rigged from the start," Ethan said. "He didn't need scholars to succeed. He needed them to fail in the right direction." Nyla thought about the press conference, the way Victor had announced a conclusion before any evidence existed, the way he had framed her as interference rather than source. He had been running the same play for 30 years, and it had worked every time, because every time the people who knew the truth had been alone and unwitnessed and easy to discredit or disappear. She was going to be different. She just had not yet figured out how. The following afternoon, Ethan made a call he had been sitting on since morning. He reached Marion Vale through a former colleague who had once worked with her at the museum before Marion was quietly forced out. Ethan explained as much as he could in 4 minutes without using names or locations. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. And then Marion said, "Say the third line of the upper register, the diagonal sequence." Ethan looked at Nyla. She leaned toward the phone and spoke the line. The sounds moved through the small kitchen the way they always did, fitting the air around them in a way that ordinary speech did not. Another silence, longer this time. "I'll come," Marion said. "Don't go anywhere until I do." She arrived 2 hours later with a canvas bag over one shoulder and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for something she had stopped believing would actually arrive. She was in her 60s, solidly built, with reading glasses pushed up into close-cropped gray hair and the careful, measuring gaze of someone who had spent decades working around people who wanted things from her that she was not going to give them. She looked at Neela for a long time without speaking. Then she set her bag on the table and took out a sealed envelope, aged and resealed more than once. "A field researcher gave me this 28 years ago," she said. "He was dying. He said someone would come eventually who could verify what was inside." She looked at Nyla again. I almost stopped believing that. Inside the envelope was a sketch of a subterranean chamber door, a set of handwritten coordinates, and a note that read, "The chamber contains the ledger of witnesses. It cannot be opened by force. It responds to the spoken sequence only." Nyla looked at the coordinates. Then she looked at the journal still open on the table beside her. Then she looked at the photographs Ethan had brought from the museum, spread across the available surface, the final quarter of the scroll with its circular symbol arrangement visible in the corner of the top image. She had been taught the final section. She had been told never to speak it lightly. She understood now why. "The coordinates," she said. "Where do they point?" Ethan checked them against a city map on his phone. He was quiet for a moment. "The eastern edge of the city, a land tract currently tied up in Victor Hale's development deal," Nyla finished, "scheduled for site clearing in 4 days." She stood and looked at the maps spread across the table. Everything that had seemed scattered, the scroll, her guardian's teachings, the journal, Marion's envelope, the missing fragment, was not scattered at all. It had always been one thing. She had been moving toward this point since before she was old enough to understand what she was carrying. She thought about the man who had taught her, the patience in his voice, the way he had never explained the full shape of what he was passing to her, only the pieces she needed to hold. She understood that now. He had not withheld the meaning to be cruel. He had withheld it because knowing the full weight of it too early would have been unbearable for a child, and he had been trying, in the only way available to him, to protect her from that weight until she was ready. She looked at Ethan and Marion. "We're going to the site," she said, "before they clear it." Marion nodded once. Ethan closed his laptop. Nyla picked up the journal, held it for a moment, and set it back on the table. He thinks the contract gives him permission," she said quietly. "It doesn't. It gives me a warning." They reached the site before first light. It was a strange stretch of land hemmed in on 3 sides by the advancing geometry of the city. New fencing, survey stakes driven into the ground at measured intervals, a row of security trailers with their generator lights still running, but the land itself resisted that framing. The soil had a different quality than the ground around it, darker and more compact, and the grass that grew along the interior edge was a different shade than the grass on the outer side of the fence line. Old trees stood at the far end at angles that suggested they had not grown freely but had been planted with intention. The whole space had the feeling of something that had been waiting. Nyla felt it the moment she stepped onto the soil. Not mystically. She was not a mystical girl. She felt it the way you feel a room that has been carefully prepared. The details were deliberate. Someone had thought about this place for a very long time. She walked slowly, not speaking, reading the ground the way she read text, spatially, looking for the pattern underneath the surface arrangement. Ethan and Marion followed without crowding her. She stopped near the center of the site and crouched down. Under a newer section of cracked concrete, just visible at the edge where the slab had shifted, a carved line ran at a precise angle into the earth. She traced it with her finger without disturbing it, stood up, moved 15 feet to the left, found another line at the same angle, different depth, moved again, found a third. "It's a perimeter map," she said. "The markers are set into the ground. Someone laid this out according to the scroll's boundary definitions." She looked back at the fence line. "The legal survey stakes are in the wrong place. Whoever filed them placed them outside the actual covenant boundary on the eastern edge." "Deliberately?" Ethan asked. "Has to be. The error only runs in one direction." Marion was moving along the interior edge of the site, pausing at intervals to examine things at ground level. She called them over after a few minutes. Tucked into a crack in an older boundary stone, barely visible and clearly recent, was a small bundle, dried grass, 2 beads, and a folded piece of paper that had been there long enough to soften at the edges. Marion opened it carefully. But the marks on the paper were not the full language of the scroll, but they were related to it. Simplified fragments, the kind passed down by someone who had caught pieces of something without having the whole. "People have been tending this site," Marion said quietly, "for a long time. Not scholars, not historians." She looked at Nyla. "People like the ones nobody bothers to interview." Nyla thought about her guardian moving from place to place, living carefully, teaching her in rooms that were never permanent. She wondered how many others there had been, how many people carrying fragments of this memory through lives that the world had decided were not worth documenting. They had perhaps 40 minutes before the site would become active with Victor's people. They used them carefully. Nyla worked across the interior space in a systematic pattern, identifying 7 additional subsurface markers, 2 acoustic vents disguised as drainage openings, 3 carved reference points, and 2 sections of ground where the soil composition was distinctly different from the surrounding terrain. These were not random features. They were components of a system. The site had been engineered to reveal itself only to someone who understood what they were looking at. Victor's private security detail arrived at the eastern fence line at 6:43 in the morning. They came with machines, floodlights mounted on portable stands, and a legal representative carrying a folder of emergency development permits issued the previous afternoon. Victor arrived 15 minutes after them in a dark car that parked at the edge of the access road. He stepped out, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the site with the unhurried authority of someone who had already decided how the morning would go. He saw Nyla and stopped walking for approximately 2 seconds. Then he continued, but something in his posture had changed. The confidence was still there. Victor Hale was too practiced for it to simply vanish, but beneath it was something tighter and less comfortable. He came to stand 20 feet away and looked at her with an expression that was almost thoughtful. "You've had a difficult few days," he said. His voice was warm in the way of a man who had learned that warmth was a more reliable tool than force. "You've been used by people who should have looked after you better. That's not your fault." He glanced briefly at Ethan and returned to Nyla. "I can fix the situation you're in. Housing, a proper school placement, legal protection from the complications around your status. Everything you need to have a real future." He paused. "All I need is for you to stop doing this." Nyla looked at him. "You're offering me a future to stop telling the truth about your past. I'm offering you a future because you deserve one. You're offering me silence wrapped in something that looks like care," she said. "I've been offered that before, usually just before someone takes the thing they wanted anyway." Victor's warmth cooled by a degree. "You have no legal standing here. No guardian, no documentation, no institutional support. Anything you claim about this site, about that scroll, about anything, it comes from a 14-year-old with no verifiable background. That's not a position of strength. "It's the truth," she said. "You should try it sometime." He looked at her for a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward his team. Marion, standing slightly behind Neela, said quietly, "He's right that we need to move fast." "I know," Neela said. "Give me a few minutes." She walked to the section of ground she had identified earlier as the primary access point, a slightly raised area near the center of the site where the soil composition changed, and two of the acoustic vents were positioned at precise angles to each other. She stood between the vents and was still for a moment, orienting herself to the space. Then she began to speak. She did not speak loudly. She spoke at the pitch and cadence the language required. Moving through the opening sequence of the scroll's spatial section, the portion that corresponded to the coordinates Marion's envelope had identified. The sounds moved out from her and through the vents and into the ground in a way that was less mystical than mechanical. The system had been engineered to respond to specific acoustic frequencies. Someone very old and very careful had built a door that could only be knocked on in one language. The ground did not shake. There was no dramatic rumble. What happened was quieter and more precise. A section of the compacted earth near the central marker shifted, almost imperceptibly, along a seam that had been invisible a moment before. Two of the drainage-style vents released a slow breath of old air, cool and dry and carrying the faint mineral smell of deep stone. The seam widened slightly. A carved edge became visible, running in a curve. Victor's excavation team, who had been watching from across the site, began moving toward the area. Victor said something sharp to his site foreman, who instructed the nearest machine operator to move in. The operator swung the arm of a mid-size excavator toward the disturbed section and brought it down. The ground gave way under the machine's pressure in the wrong place. A hidden cavity approximately 6 feet to the right of the operator's target collapsed inward, and the excavator's front end dropped suddenly, its arm plunging into an unseen void. The machine listed hard to one side. The operator threw himself clear before it tipped fully, landing on the ground and rolling. The machine settled at a 40-degree angle with its arm buried in the subsurface cavity, engines still running, a hydraulic fluid leaking dark across the soil. Workers backed away. Several were on their phones. Two of Victor's security detail were speaking rapidly into earpieces. Victor's composure had not broken, but it had cracked at the edges. He looked at the stuck machine and at the seam in the ground, and at Neela, and in that sequence the calculation in his eyes shifted from controlled to desperate. "Get it out," he said to the foreman. "Sir, the ground is—" "Get it out." 3 workers looked at each other and did not move toward the machine. Ethan stepped up beside Neela. "Now," he said quietly. She returned to the central point and continued the sequence. The seam opened further, revealing a narrow descending passage lined with fitted stone. The air that rose from it was old and preserved, and carried the specific quality of a sealed space that had not been disturbed in a very long time, cool and still and serious. The entrance was low and narrow. Neela went first, then Ethan, then Marion, who paused at the top step and looked back at the site above them, the tilted excavator, the scattered workers, Victor standing at a distance with his phone pressed to his ear, before she descended. The chamber beneath was not large. It was perhaps 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a ceiling that required Ethan to duck slightly at the center. The walls were lined with sealed clay cases of varying sizes, their surfaces intact. Carved testimony panels ran along both long walls in columns of dense, precise text. What witness tablets were stacked in organized arrangements in the far corner, each one sealed with a hardened clay coating. The floor was clean stone. The air was dry and perfectly preserved. Ethan stood in the center and turned slowly, and his expression was that of someone watching an entire academic career worth of assumptions quietly dissolve. Marion went straight to the carved walls and began examining the testimony columns with shaking hands and the careful restraint of someone who had been an archivist for 30 years and understood what touching meant in a space like this. Nyla walked to the far wall. The registry of speakers and witnesses was carved there, a list that ran in the formal style of the scroll's legal sections. Symbol names, sequence marks, dates rendered in the Covenant's own calendar system. The entries ran from the oldest at the top, weathered and worn, to the newest at the bottom, still sharp-edged and clear. The final complete entry was her guardian's symbol name, the diamond pattern with the 5th mark at center that she had been recognizing all week in fragments without letting herself name it. It was there, complete, unambiguous. Beside it was a mark she had not seen before, a small secondary symbol that meant, in the scroll's legal language, acting under concealment of duty. He had registered himself but hidden the registration, not abandoning the role, performing it in secret because the people hunting the Covenant were already watching official channels. Below his entry, the final line of the registry was unfinished. A beginning of a symbol name had been started and not completed. The partial marks were in a style different from all the others, less formal, rougher, as if they had been added quickly by someone who was not trained in the ceremonial script, but knew enough of the language to attempt it. They looked like the marks she made in her own notebook. They looked like someone trying to write her name who did not yet have the full language to complete it. Her hand rose and pressed flat against the wall beside the unfinished entry. The stone was cool and very old and completely real. She stood there for a long moment. Above them, she could hear the muffled sounds of voices and machinery and the ongoing chaos of a man trying to control something that had already moved beyond him. "He was never hiding from me," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, but only just. "He was hiding me from them." They spent 2 hours in the chamber before the sound of approaching vehicles above them made further examination impossible. What those 2 hours confirmed was this: the archive was not symbolic. It was not ceremonial in any vague spiritual sense. It was functional, precise, and built to last by people who understood that power rarely surrendered documentation willingly. The clay cases along the walls contained rolled and sealed records, territorial agreements, sworn witness accounts, records of violations, and evidence of forced removals that predated the city around them by generations. The testimony panels carved into the walls provided cross-references, dates, and names. The witness tablets in the corner were sealed with authentication marks that Nyla recognized from the scroll's legal register, the same formal certification system used throughout the Covenant document, which meant the tablets could be independently verified against the scroll itself. Marion moved through the space with the contained urgency of someone who had spent decades protecting fragments of something and was now standing inside the whole of it. She touched nothing she did not need to touch. She read quickly and remembered accurately. She was the right person to be in this room. Ethan photographed everything he could before his phone battery dropped to 12% and he stopped to conserve what remained. When they came back up, the sight above them had changed. Word had moved faster than Victor had planned. A construction worker had shared a 20-second video from the moment the excavator went into the hidden cavity, and by the time Nyla climbed out of the chamber entrance into the gray morning light, the clip had been viewed enough times that 2 local news vans were already positioning themselves beyond the outer fence line. Victor was on the phone and not looking at cameras. That, Nyla noted, was new. He had spent the past 4 days arranging every situation so that cameras pointed where he wanted them. This morning he was turned away from them, and the effort that took was visible in the set of his shoulders. She understood immediately what he would do next. He could not destroy the chamber. Not now, not with footage already circulating. What he could do was claim it, flood the interpretation before independent experts arrived. Control the framing the way he had tried to control the translation, by establishing the conclusion before the evidence could speak for itself. By noon, he had done exactly that. Through his foundation's communications office, a statement went out declaring the discovery of what was described as a significant heritage site, which the Hale Foundation was committed to preserving under its cultural stewardship mandate. The statement referenced an emergency heritage protection filing submitted that morning. It described the site as having been responsibly brought to light through the Foundation's own development review process. It did not mention Nyla. It did not mention the scroll. It did not mention the covenant. Ethan's university suspension notice arrived by email that same afternoon. Unauthorized interference with a protected cultural artifact, conduct unbecoming a research affiliate, access to university databases, and facilities revoked pending review. His mentor, the same scholar who had stood on the museum stage and failed to read a single symbol, appeared on a regional news broadcast that evening, suggesting that the events at the site were the result of a coordinated campaign by fringe academics to discredit a legitimate development project. Ethan read the suspension notice once, set his phone face down on the table, and did not speak for several minutes. "I'm sorry," Nyla said. "She meant it." "Don't be," he said. He picked the phone back up. "I've been writing papers for 8 years that 9 people read. This is the first thing I've done that actually mattered." He paused. "I just wish it didn't cost this much." She understood that. The cost of truth in an institution built to manage it was always paid by the people who could least afford it. She had known that her whole life. Ethan was learning it now, which was different. Learning it when you had something to lose gave it a weight that knowing it in the abstract never did. Marion's apartment was broken into that night. She was not there when it happened. She was with them at the row house, but she found out when a neighbor called. The door had been forced neatly, in the way of people who know how to force doors without looking like they have. Several boxes of archived materials she had kept in her back room were gone. The rest of the apartment was undisturbed. Whoever went in knew exactly what they were looking for. But Marion listened to her neighbor's account on the phone, thanked her, and hung up. Then she sat down at the row house table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "They took the copies," she said. "Not the originals. The originals are in a safety deposit box they don't know about." She looked at Nyla. "But they sent a message." "I know," Nyla said. "It changes my answer," Marion said. "I was going to suggest caution. Now I'm suggesting speed." There was one problem with speed. The Chamber's most critical enforcement records, the ones that named specific violations and the parties responsible for them, were cross-referenced to the Covenant's final clauses, and those clauses existed in complete form only in the scroll's second fragment. Without it, the evidentiary chain had a gap that Victor's lawyers could exploit indefinitely. Or they could question the tablet's authenticity. They could argue the Chamber was unrelated to the scroll. They could manufacture uncertainty the way Victor manufactured everything else, methodically and expensively. They needed the second fragment. Ethan found it through a chain of 3 database searches and a 20-year-old acquisition record that had been misfiled under an institutional donor category rather than an artifact transfer log. The fragment was held at a private storage facility connected to the Hale Foundation's archival holdings, a climate-controlled building on the west side that officially stored decommissioned museum materials and private collections. They went that night. Then Marion provided old museum routing codes from memory, access protocols that had not been changed in years because nobody believed anyone still had them. They worked. The facility's rear service entrance accepted the code, and they were inside within 4 minutes. The fragment was stored in a sealed case in the third aisle of the archive floor, labeled under a donor acquisition number that corresponded to nothing in the public record. Beside it, in a companion case, were legal drafts already prepared and dated, transfer documents that would assign full interpretive and custodial authority over the covenant to the Hale Foundation the moment the Chamber became a matter of public record. The paperwork had been sitting there, ready to file, for at least 8 months. Ethan photographed the legal drafts before he touched anything else. Then he carefully removed the fragment case and opened it. The second piece of the scroll was slightly smaller than the first. Its symbols were denser in the central band, and the final section contained the enforcement clauses in their complete form. All the names, all the dates, all the specific transferable consequences that the first fragment's partial text had only gestured toward. Together, the two pieces formed something whole and unambiguous. Apart, each one could be argued into uncertainty. Nyla held the fragment for a moment before Ethan took it for safekeeping. She was not reading it. She was feeling the weight of it and thinking about the man who had taught her. He had known this piece existed. He had known where it went, and what it meant, and what someone would have to do to bring both halves back together. What in the far corner of the same aisle, on a shelf of older digitization materials, Ethan found a small audio cylinder in a protective housing, and beside it, a portable playback unit with a handwritten label. Coal Excavation. Voice record. Personal field notes. Cole, his grandfather's name. He looked at Nyla. She looked at the cylinder. Neither of them spoke. He played it. The voice was not Douglas Cole's. It was a voice Nyla recognized from somewhere deeper than memory. In the way that you recognize a sound your body knew before your mind did. Calm, careful, slightly hoarse, the way a voice goes when a person spends a long time being quiet. He had recorded the message for whoever came next, whoever found this archive and understood what it contained. When he explained clearly and without self-pity what had happened, that he had tried to bring the Covenant's truth forward through official channels years earlier, that he had been hunted for it, that he had been forced underground, that the life he had built around this duty had been dismantled piece by piece until going invisible was the only protection left. He explained that he had found a child after a violent displacement event tied indirectly to the same land network, a child whose ability to hear the language's tonal patterns was instinctive in a way he had never encountered and had not expected. He had not chosen her because she was convenient. He had believed she might succeed where he had failed. He had taught her everything he could carry. And then the people looking for him had gotten close enough that staying near her became more dangerous to her than leaving. He had not abandoned her. He had run away from her on purpose to keep them from following him to where she was. The recording ended. The playback unit's small speaker hissed softly in the quiet aisle. Nyla stood very still. Her face was not composed in the way it usually was. The composure was still there, but it was doing visible work now, and Ethan and Marion both had the grace to look elsewhere for a moment and give her the private space of a feeling that large. She had spent years understanding her life as a series of things that had happened to her. A man who was there and then gone. A child on her own in a city that had not been designed with her in mind. A girl carrying sounds she could not explain, and a language nobody else seemed to know. She understood now that it had not been happening to her. It had been moving through her. She was not the end of the story. She was the part the story had been building toward. That was a large thing to hold. She held it. "Tomorrow," she said. Her voice was even. "We go public on our own terms." She contacted 2 independent journalists that night through Marion's secure channels. One, a documentary filmmaker who had spent years covering land rights cases. The other, a print reporter with a record of protecting sources. She told them where to be and what time. She told community members Marion had been quietly reaching, the people who had left offerings at the site, of the families who had preserved fragments of the protector tradition in ways that scholarship had never bothered to record, and she told them what was going to happen and asked them to witness it. Victor had one night to stop her. He spent it filing injunctions. None of them landed in time. Nyla looked at Ethan before she went to sleep on the row house cot for the last time and said, He spent his whole life buying silence. Tomorrow he's going to hear what it costs. Morning arrived with a crowd nobody had fully anticipated. They had told people, but people had told people. And those people had told others. And the story that had been quietly building for days, a homeless girl, an ancient scroll, a billionaire developer, also a buried chamber, had moved through the city the way real things move when institutions stop being able to contain them, sideways, through conversations and shared videos, and the kind of word of mouth that does not require a press release. By 8 in the morning, the site's outer perimeter had more people than it had fence. Residents from nearby neighborhoods stood alongside activists and dismissed historians and journalists and workers who had been on Victor's construction crew and were no longer. Elderly people who had grown up near this land and been displaced from it over decades. Families from shelters and transitional housing. A retired bus driver holding a handwritten sign that said simply, "We knew." Police barricades strained at the eastern fence line. News cameras were positioned at 4 different angles. Victor arrived with lawyers and a stack of emergency injunctions and the expression of a man who had never once in his life walked into a room where the numbers were against him and was discovering what that felt like. He moved to the front of the gathered crowd with the directness of someone who had decided that the best play remaining was the performance of authority. He spoke loudly and clearly for the cameras. He said Nyla had no legal standing, no guardian, no documentation, no institutional affiliation, no verifiable identity in any system the law recognized. He said that any claims made by a minor with no authenticated background could not serve as the basis for voiding legitimate property rights, no matter how compelling the story. He said the word story with a particular emphasis that was meant to remind everyone present that stories and facts were different things. He said it was a shame and that he personally wished the situation were different, but that the law was the law. The crowd was not quiet while he spoke, but it was not chaotic either. It was the particular quality of stillness that a large group of people produces when they are listening carefully because they are about to respond. A woman near the front stepped forward first. She was in her 40s and worked at a family shelter 3 blocks from the site, and she had known Nyla by name for 2 years, had let her use the shelter's reading room on cold evenings, had once found her a pair of dry socks and a meal without making it into a transaction. She said so, clearly, for the cameras. A librarian spoke next. Then a food vendor who described specific conversations, specific corners, specific mornings. A former day laborer who had worked the site boundary for a survey company 6 years ago and been told to file the stakes in the wrong position and had known it was wrong and had not said so until now. An elderly man who produced, from a coat pocket, a piece of paper with symbols on it that his grandmother had given him when he was a child, with instructions to keep it and not lose it and not let anyone take it, though she had not told him why. Marion stepped forward with archived correspondence, physical letters, dated, documenting her attempts to report tampering with discovery records going back 19 years. She named names. She named dates. She named the specific administrators who had intercepted her filings and the foundation donation records that explained why. Ethan stood at Nyla's side and said nothing because there was nothing he needed to say. His presence was the statement. Victor watched the crowd building Nyla's standing piece by piece in public and in real time, and for the first time since the night of the museum event, his composure did not merely crack at the edges. It developed a fault line. Nyla stepped forward with both fragments of the scroll, the museum piece and the recovered second fragment, held carefully in archival sleeves. The ledger from the chamber had been brought up and placed on a portable table that Marion had thought to bring. The documentary filmmaker's camera was running. The print reporter's recorder was clipped to a post nearby. Legal observers from 2 independent civil rights organizations stood at the edge of the witness line. She began the reading. She started in the ancient spoken cadence, moving through the opening register at a pace that allowed the tonal layers to settle fully before advancing. Her voice was steady and unhurried. The crowd around her was mostly quiet, responding not to the words, which most of them could not parse, but to the quality of the sound, which carried a gravity that did not require translation to be felt. Then she translated, clause by clause, in plain language, the land's original boundaries, the custodial obligations, the preservation requirements, the community access provisions, the record-keeping duties, and the enforcement clause that any party knowingly suppressing or falsifying the covenant's terms surrendered all claims immediately and irrevocably, and that custodial authority transferred to a public trust activated by a living speaker in the presence of witnesses. Victor's development deal collapsed in public, clause by clause, in front of cameras, in front of the people his lawyers would have to argue against, in front of workers who had been on his payroll and were now standing on the other side of the fence line. He interrupted 3 times. The first 2 times he argued procedure and standing. The third time he said something about the scroll's authentication that was technically precise and substantively irrelevant. And then, because control had slipped and the space where his composure had been was filling with something less managed, he said something he should not have said. He referenced a survey anomaly from the original excavation that had never been made public. He referenced it in enough detail to demonstrate that he had known about it for 30 years, which meant he had known the chamber was there, which meant he had known what the land contained when he filed his development application, which meant every legal representation his company had made about the site's historical status had been made in knowing contradiction of evidence he personally possessed. Journalists wrote it down as he said it. His own lead counsel put a hand on his arm and said something quietly into his ear. Victor went still. He looked at the crowd, then at Nyla, then at the cameras. He had spent his entire career being the person who decided what the record said. He was standing in front of the moment when that stopped being true, and he could see it clearly, and there was nothing left to buy. Nyla reached the final sealed section. She paused there, not from uncertainty, but from the same instinct she had carried for years, the one her guardian had trained into her. Know who is listening before you speak the last part. She looked at the crowd, at the legal observers, at the cameras that would carry this to every place she could not stand in person, at Ethan and Marion. She knew who was listening. She spoke the declaration of witness in full, the legal activation phrase that the covenant had been built around, the words that turned a private truth into a recorded public fact. When she finished the spoken cadence, she translated it once, clearly. What was buried is witnessed. What was witnessed is recorded. What is recorded cannot be owned. Inside the chamber, confirmed by Ethan, who descended immediately after, a secondary compartment had unlocked, triggered by the acoustic sequence, precisely as the scroll described. Inside were authentication tools, sealed verification tablets, cross-referenced records linking the covenant to documented historical periods, witness seals that could be independently tested against known archaeological standards. The truth had left a paper trail that was older and more thorough than anyone trying to dispute it. Victor left the site without speaking further. His lawyers remained to manage the legal exposure, but the man himself walked to his car and drove away, and the crowd watched him go the way you watch something that used to be large become small at a distance. There were things that did not resolve quickly because real things rarely do. Victor faced investigation by 3 separate bodies within the following weeks. The museum entered a forced institutional review. Several scholars who had built careers around interpretations the chamber's contents directly contradicted began the uncomfortable process of revising their positions. Long-ignored communities filed formal claims tied to the covenant's public trust provisions and were met, for the first time, with a legal framework that recognized their standing. Ethan built the independent verification team from a small group of academics who had been waiting for a reason to say what they actually believed. He was not the center of that work. he was careful not to be. The chamber's contents deserved interpreters who approached them with the right posture, and he spent a long time making sure the people around the table understood the difference between studying something and owning its meaning. Marion was formally recognized for the records she had protected and the warnings she had given that had been deliberately ignored. The recognition was quiet and institutional and late by decades, which was honest, and she accepted it with the dignity of someone who had never done it for recognition anyway. The offer came to Naila from 3 directions almost simultaneously: housing, a school placement, and a role as primary speaker for the newly formed public trust that would oversee the site and its archive. The role had been shaped carefully to avoid recreating the structure it was meant to replace. The trust was community-governed. The speaker's function was witness and translation, not authority. There were oversight mechanisms. There were multiple voices. She agreed to the role on the condition that the language, the spoken, tonal, living language of the covenant, would be taught openly, not owned by the trust, not restricted to credentialed scholars, not managed by any institution with a financial interest in limiting access. Taught to anyone who could learn it, especially children from the shelters and transitional housing nearest the site. The trust agreed. A few weeks later, on a Tuesday morning with a low gray sky and the smell of old books in the air, Naila sat in a restored reading room on the 2nd floor of a building that overlooked the preserved site. Below the window, the land was still and quiet, and had the particular quality of a place that was finally being left alone to be what it was. In the room with her were 11 children between the ages of 7 and 12. They were from 4 different shelters and 2 public schools. They had been told they were going to learn something old and important, and that no one had ever been taught it in a classroom before. They were paying very close attention. Naila opened the ledger on the table in front of her, not the original, which lived in climate-controlled preservation, but a careful reproduction, and looked at the final entry in the registry, or her guardian's symbol name, the unfinished marks below it that someone had started before she arrived, and below those, in fresh ink added by her own hand 2 weeks after the declaration at the site, her own symbol name, complete. She placed her hand flat on the page. She heard, in some interior place that was not quite memory and not quite imagination, a calm voice in a bare room by a fire, patient, careful. Passing something forward through the dark, she looked up at the children. "We're going to start with sound," she said. "Not letters, not words. Just the sounds your mouth can make when you stop trying to speak the way you were taught and start listening to what the language actually needs from you." She paused. "It's going to feel strange at first. That's fine. Strange means you're paying attention." A 7-year-old in the front row with both hands flat on the table looked at her with the complete seriousness of a child who understood that something real was happening. "Okay," the child said. Naila almost smiled. "Okay," she said. She placed her finger on the first symbol and began. Outside, the land held its old quiet. The city moved around it the way water moves around something that has decided not to move. The morning passed. The sounds of a language that had survived by finding the right people to carry it filled a room where the windows were large and the light was good, and 11 children listened with the particular attention of those who have been told for the first time that what they carry matters. Naila watched them and thought they thought the contract was about who could own the land. It was always about who would tell the truth when ownership became a lie. If the most powerful people in the room spent their whole lives deciding whose voice was worth hearing, what does that say about every voice they chose to silence? If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and stay close, because the next one might just change the way you see the world again.